As dawn broke over St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday in 2025, the air carried more than just the reverberation of bells, it carried the weight of prophecy. Pope Francis, frail and seated in a wheelchair, emerged one last time onto the balcony, his voice trembling but determined. To some, it was simply a farewell, but to many, especially those steeped in prophecy and faith, this moment marked something much deeper, a divine handover, a closing chapter in sacred history. His appearance wasn't theatrical, it was deliberate. He knew the power of presence in silence, of symbols over speeches. The faithful were not merely witnessing a sermon, they were witnessing a sign. He uttered few words, but they echoed centuries of Catholic tradition: Christ is risen. In that declaration, he wrapped his legacy not of governance or reform, but of spiritual awakening. As news of his passing followed just hours later, the world paused. Was it coincidence that his final message fell on Easter, the day of resurrection and renewal? Or was it a deliberate punctuation mark, an invitation to prepare to reflect and perhaps to awaken? This script explores not only the Pope's final blessing, but what it may mean for the Church, the world, and the unfolding of prophecies many believe are coming to life. We will journey through faith, fear, confusion, and hope. We'll examine how modern culture interacts with the sacred, how ancient prophecies find new relevance, and how Pope Francis's final act might be a compass pointing toward an unknown future. The final Easter message symbol oversound. Easter Sunday 2025. Unlike past years filled with booming homilies and papal processions, this Easter was quiet, heavy, sacred. Pope Francis, aware of his declining health, insisted on making a public appearance. Not out of duty, but out of deep spiritual urgency. Seated on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, he didn't deliver a lengthy homily. Instead, he gave a minimal message, and in that minimalism lay its power. Observers noted his weakened frame, his soft voice barely reaching the crowd. Yet no one questioned the potency of what was said: Christ is risen. These three words didn't just reflect doctrine, they captured the essence of Christian identity: resurrection, renewal, and spiritual awakening. His final gift to the Church was a living reminder of these truths. Equally powerful was his decision to have his master of ceremonies deliver most of the message. This subtle gesture, unprecedented in Easter traditions, was interpreted by Vatican insiders as a symbolic passing of the torch, not just to a successor, but to the faithful. His message wasn't reserved for one office. It was a communal responsibility. Social media amplified this moment. His official account shared what would become his final tweet: Christ is risen. In a world drowning in noise, that digital whisper cut through the static. It reminded billions that sacred truths remain constant even in a fragmented world. The Pope's restraint was a message itself: when the world is loud, be still. When the sacred is mocked, be reverent. And when the world darkens, light a single candle of faith. More than a goodbye, it was a sacred handoff to live fully, believe deeply, and prepare faithfully. The passing of a pontiff, end of an era. Only hours after Pope Francis gave his final public blessing, the world awoke to the news of his death. The Vatican confirmed his passing due to complications from a cerebral stroke. Though expected by some due to his visible frailty in the months prior, the moment still hit with shocking immediacy. His final appearance on Easter now seemed like a farewell he had choreographed with divine timing. The Church entered mourning, but also reflection. Francis was not just the Bishop of Rome. He was a reformer, a diplomat, and most of all, a spiritual father to over 1 billion Catholics. His death wasn't merely the conclusion of a papal reign. It marked the end of a spiritual chapter, one defined by mercy, inclusion, and the return to Christ-centered simplicity. World leaders, theologians, and even critics responded with unexpected reverence. Messages poured in from presidents, prime ministers, imams, rabbis, and atheists alike, each acknowledging the Pope's moral influence beyond doctrine. But perhaps most striking was how ordinary believers responded. In the silence of churches across the globe, candles were lit, rosaries were held, and prayers whispered. The global Catholic community, even in its theological divisions, paused in unity. This wasn't just grief, it was transition. An ancient institution once again stood on the threshold between continuity and change. As the papal apartments darkened and white smoke would one day rise again, many wondered what next. Had the Pope's final words been a warning, a prophecy, or simply a reflection of a man who, like Christ, chose to make his final moments a message of eternal truth. Regardless of one's beliefs, the spiritual resonance of that Easter Sunday would not soon be forgotten. Aaron prophecy and symbolism, echoes of Fatima and Malachi. Soon after Pope Francis' death, conversation shifted from grief to mystery. Spiritual scholars and prophecy watchers recalled two striking traditions, the apparitions at Fatima and the so-called prophecy of the popes attributed to Saint Malachi. Could this moment, the final message of Francis, his passing on Easter, the global unrest, be the unfolding of something foretold? The Fatima apparitions of 1917 remain one of the most discussed events in Catholic mysticism. The Third Secret of Fatima, released by the Vatican in 2000, contained a vision of a bishop in white who would suffer for the Church amidst ruins and martyrdom. Some now suggest Pope Francis fit that description, not just in color but in essence. A bishop of peace walking through a world in chaos, offering himself not with pride, but with grace. Then there's the Malachi prophecy, a cryptic 12th century list that seemingly predicts each pope by a symbolic Latin phrase. The final pope, referred to as Peter the Roman, is described as shepherding the flock through tribulations before the city of seven hills is destroyed and judgment begins. Many aligned Francis with this figure, not literally, but thematically. He was a Roman-born spiritual father guiding the church through cultural upheaval, global war, and inner reform. Of course, the Church has never confirmed these prophecies. The Vatican treats them with caution, even skepticism. But the question remains, are we seeing divine timing at work, or are we simply projecting meaning onto coincidence? What's clear is that for believers, these symbolic connections stir a deeper awareness. Not to panic, but to prepare. Not to speculate, but to be spiritually vigilant. Whether prophecy or poetry, these signs invite us to pause, to reflect, and to seek clarity in uncertain times. Reverence fading, the sacred in a mocking world. One of Pope Francis' most consistent concerns during his papacy was the growing irreverence in modern culture. He didn't point fingers at atheists or skeptics. His warning was deeper. He saw a world increasingly numb to the sacred, where even believers grew casual, indifferent, or entertained by what once evoked awe. The media, he warned, often blurs reverence and ridicule. Religious imagery is no longer reserved for sanctuaries. It's often repackaged for marketing or satire. Crosses adorn fashion runways, sacred symbols feature in horror films, and divine narratives are twisted into clickbait. While some of this may be creative expression, the Pope believed it pointed to a dangerous trend. When the sacred becomes entertainment, its power to transform is lost. This wasn't a call to censorship. It was a call to mindfulness. Francis didn't fear art, he feared apathy. He reminded believers that sacred things must be treated with care, not because God needs protection, but because we need grounding. When reverence disappears, so too does meaning. Real-life examples abound. Churches turned into nightclubs, religious festivals stripped of prayer, and social media influencers invoking the divine for views rather than devotion. These aren't isolated cases, they form a cultural pattern. And the Pope saw it as spiritually corrosive. His remedy wasn't rage, it was reverence. He called for a return to silence, to stillness, to humility before the mystery of the divine. To let our hearts be moved not by spectacle, but by presence. In a world that mocks the sacred for profit or provocation, Pope Francis offered an alternative to find joy in the holy, to protect what uplifts the soul, and to live with quiet devotion in a noisy world. Sonnerie, real-life examples. Faith in the face of cultural decline. In the final years of his papacy, Pope Francis repeatedly called attention to the quiet erosion of faith, not through persecution, but through distraction. His concern wasn't just about what the world was doing to faith, but what believers were failing to do for theirs. One powerful example comes from Paris, where the famous Notre Dame Cathedral, once the heart of French Catholicism, has seen a shift not just in attendance, but in meaning. Tourists outnumber worshippers, and many visit not for Mass, but for a photo. The sacred has become a backdrop, not a center. Likewise, in the U.S., studies from Pew Research show a steady decline in religious affiliation, especially among youth. Faith, once inherited from family and community, is now often seen as optional, one identity among many. Yet amidst this decline, something else is stirring. Small pockets of revival are forming. In Brazil, young Catholics are embracing Eucharistic adoration with renewed fervor. In Nigeria, priests walk for miles to reach remote congregations, risking their lives in the process. In South Korea, underground prayer movements are growing quietly, fueled by the desire to reconnect with reverence. These stories, far from mainstream media's radar, embody Pope Francis's final call: stay vigilant. Don't let the world define what is holy. Rediscover God not in spectacle but in sacrifice. Francis believed that the true church isn't built on popularity, it's built on perseverance. He urged believers to resist the tide of indifference with quiet conviction. These real-life stories serve not just as inspiration, but as instruction that even when the broader culture strays, individuals can still choose devotion. And in doing so, they become living proof that reverence is not dead, it's just waiting to be reawakened. A shepherd's plea: grace, before it's too late. In his final message, Pope Francis avoided the language of fear. He didn't talk of doom or punishment. Instead, he spoke of grace, urgent, available, but not everlasting. His message was a shepherd's plea: return to the heart of faith while the door is still open. He compared our spiritual condition to a drifting boat. The harbor of grace is near the path, clear, but many remain distracted, unaware of the approaching storm. His concern wasn't that people hated faith, it was that they ignored it. The danger, he said, was not in outright rebellion, but in spiritual laziness. When the sacred becomes secondary, the soul suffers. Francis echoed a theme often found in the Gospels, that God's mercy is immense but not indefinite. The invitation is now. And though the future remains uncertain, this moment, this very hour, is a gift. To delay is to gamble with time we may not have. One of the most moving parts of his final message was this: God never turns away from us. If there is any distance, it is we who step back. That line encapsulates his theology, not of wrath, but of relationship. We are not abandoned, but we must choose to turn around. This isn't about scaring people into belief. It's about reminding them that the door is open, but it won't remain open forever. The grace offered now is deep and transformative. But like all things in life, it's time-sensitive. In this, the Pope's message is less about prophecy and more about personal responsibility. He knew his time was ending, but his concern was for ours. Will we act while the light is still present, or wait until the shadows fall? A final call to wakefulness and hope. In the final days of his life, Pope Francis didn't leave us with fear or dogma. He left us with silence, symbolism, and an invitation. His Easter message wasn't just for the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square. It was for the whole world, for skeptics and saints, for the distracted and devoted alike. In the face of mockery, apathy, and spiritual fatigue, his voice, though frail, remained firm: Christ is risen. It was a declaration of renewal, not just in doctrine, but in destiny. As we reflect on his passing and the context surrounding it, from the echoes of ancient prophecies to the modern crisis of reverence, we are left with a vital question: are we awake? The point isn't to speculate on timelines or fear political shifts. It's not about decoding every sign. It's about discerning the present moment. Francis reminded us that grace is now. Faith isn't a formula, it's a relationship. And relationships require attention, commitment, and love. Whether or not one believes in Fatima Maliki or end-time symbols, one thing remains true: each of us has a soul, and each soul has a choice. In an age of noise, silence becomes sacred. In a world chasing power, humility becomes holy. And in a culture that dismisses the divine, simple faith becomes revolutionary. Pope Francis may be gone, but his legacy lingers, not in headlines or history books, but in the quiet decisions we make each day to return to truth, to honor the sacred, and to walk forward with hope.